I feel like the last few weeks have been pretty crazy, but we can get back to normal now. This week, I'm doing something I probably should have done earlier, and my apologies. I told you guys you're kind of the guinea pigs, and here's a prime example. I probably should have gone over this information earlier in the semester, and it didn't occur to me. It's chapter 10 in your textbook. It probably should be chapter 3. So we're going to try to get to it this week. We've got two PowerPoints, and they're both really basically the same information. The difference is really minimal. One's from your book, and one is what I created. And the one I created is based on what I learned when I was in school studying this. So it's the same information from different sources with slightly different materials. We're going to be looking at chapter 10, which is behavioral objectives, and then the other PowerPoint we'll look at will be better how to write objectives. Goals and objectives are slightly different. Goals are broad and objectives are more narrow and specific. Now, it is possible for a goal and an objective to be basically the same thing, although not always. So make sure that you're using the right word and saying what you actually mean. If I'm talking about teaching you how to play chess, I can break that up into different phases, like teaching you what the different pieces are and teaching you the different moves, and ultimately then you would know how to play the game. The goal may be to play the game, but it depends. If today's lesson is how to move the pieces, then the goal is how to move the pieces. The objectives might be piece number 1 moves this way and piece number 2 moves that way. Then in that case, the goal may be the same with different objectives based on the whole. So the whole is learning how to play chess. If you're doing this over a period of a semester, then the end of semester goal is the student will have learned how to play chess. And then we'll figure out a way to qualify that, beating their opponent 50% of the time. But daily, each class period that you sit down together, you might have a different daily goal with different objectives to see to it that you meet those goals. Learning how to write good objectives was probably one of the hardest technical things I learned when I was in school. It takes a long time and a lot of practice to write good objectives. And again, I should have done this earlier in the semester, but I kind of threw you guys to the wolves, so my apologies. There are a lot of common mistakes that people make when they try to write objectives. And when you guys turned in your lesson plans to me, I bet almost every one of these rules was broken by someone in the class. Again, my fault for doing this. When you write an objective, you want to make sure that it's pretty narrow and pretty specific, and it's attainable, and it's something you can measure. If it's too broad, then no one knows what you're looking for. And to be honest, that's the most common mistake, that most of the objectives that you guys wrote were probably too broad, they were too general, or they did not have an attainability. There was no way to know when you had actually achieved it. I don't think any of you guys realized that, but as I read through one after another of your papers, I thought, yeah, this is totally my fault. So most of the time you guys are too general, and that's really common, and I think it's probably more common with people who go into our field, because we don't want to limit ourselves, because you never know when good information will just tumble out of someone and you'll say, oh wow, you really got it. But unfortunately, that's objectives. We have to force the line, and it's uncomfortable for most of us as respiratory therapists. It was for me anyway, and so we'll work on it. But anyway, you have to make sure that you're describing what you want the student to do, not what you as the instructor are going to do. That's your lesson plan. You can't put more than one thing in your objective. For example, if you say I'm going to teach you how to play chess, and you'll be graded if you can get the opening gambit right and remember which direction the pieces move 50% of the time, you will have attained the goal, or the objective, sorry. Well, unfortunately, what happens if someone gets 100% of the pieces correct, but they get like 30% of the opening gambit right? I mean, they've achieved half of the goal and not achieved the other half of the goal. So what grade do you give them? So there's that. There are also different pieces, which we will cover mostly in the second PowerPoint, the different components that you need to include. It says 4 in your book. I've got a little system where I can use 3, and that's because some of it to me is self-explanatory. These should look familiar to you because these are basically the levels of Bloom's taxonomy. These are levels of cognitive behavior, and these are the things that we could, in fact, evaluate with an objective. According to your book, the cognitive domain is the thinking domain, which I would agree with completely. It is what you get when you have a lot of practice doing something, and a lot of practice when you spread that practice around, then a lot of accomplishment. There are different levels. Again, it goes back to Bloom's taxonomy of the affective domain. The affective as opposed to the psychomotor or the cognitive domain. This is receiving, responding, valuing, organization, and characterization. And I'm not going to talk too much about this because we have limited time in this course. And most of what we will be doing will be in the cognitive domain. The affective domain is generally for what I would consider the soft subjects, like psychology and sociology, things like that. There's a lot of thinking and feeling and emotion involved in these domains, and so they don't typically affect what we do as respiratory therapists. So I'm going to shy away from this for the moment because it's real soft stuff. If you find yourself going into human resources, then this would be something for you to go back and look at. Psychomotor is the third domain, and we do spend a lot of time doing that as respiratory therapists. This is a skills set, skills levels, and cognitive and psychomotor in these cases sometimes overlap. And you have to have cognitive information in order to perform some of the psychomotor skills. So for example, before I can tell you to put a cannula on someone, I will need to have described and explained why you're doing that and how to calculate FiO2s, for example. That's cognitive. The psychomotor skill is physically putting the cannula on someone. So in our lives, in our world, these two are frequently combined. A teaching plan is a lesson plan, and we've already spent a lot of time going over that. So the list here should look really familiar, should be what you've already seen is necessary to be included in a good, solid lesson plan. You've got to have a purpose, explain the materials you need, the process you're going to go through, the objectives of the lesson, and also how you know when you've met those objectives, and different evaluation methods for your students. So nothing here should be new. Learning contracts are fairly normal and common in adult education, andragogy. But with younger students, they're not necessarily useful because the student has to be old enough to be responsible for their own actions and their own learning. And so a learning contract really is it's a formal written document between the student and the teacher, with the teacher saying, I promise to give you this lesson, teach you how to do this thing, I promise to provide these materials, and it may have a date and time in it. And I promise to do this before a certain date. The student, on the other hand, their portion of the contract says, I promise to show up, I promise to do whatever you tell me to do, I promise to put in my best effort. If there are any materials I have to bring myself, I promise to do that. And so it's a contract between a teacher and a student. But it puts a lot of stress on the student to do a good job. And because it makes them more responsible for their own education, again, it's better for adults. It really does make everyone accountable. It makes both sides of the equation accountable. Everyone learns on a curve. There's a point when you're not learning anything, to learning a little bit, learning a lot, then you tend to plateau, and then you go back to learning more. And there's a finite amount you can learn. At that point, you have to move on to something else. And this is true for small goals and large alike. The larger ones certainly take longer, but there are different phases. For example, if I'm teaching you how to play chess, if you don't know, each piece on a chessboard has a certain move it can make. They're limited. So the knight, for example, which is that little piece that looks like a horse, it makes this L-shaped move. It has to move 3 squares, but not 3 consecutive squares. It makes like a 90-degree angle. That's all that piece can do. So as I'm teaching you how to play chess, I could say, this piece does this, and this piece does that, and that's it. They can do nothing else. At that point, you would sort of approach the limit, if you will. You've now learned what each piece does. You haven't learned how to play the game yet, really, but you've learned this part of playing the game. And so that it's one goal in the whole of learning how to play chess. So one goal would be learning what each piece does. So once you learn that, then we can move on to another portion. But you see that learning chess, to play chess, has several different phases, and each phase has different goals, and you must attain all the goals before you can become a master player. So once you learned how the pieces moved, then you can learn what the different opening gambits are, and then you can learn different moves, and these moves, because they're so old and famous, they have names. So you can begin studying the masters and figuring out how to best outsmart their opponents. But there are different phases. And I would say respiratory therapy education is exactly the same. You start off from day one and you don't know anything. And by the end of the first semester, you can put oxygen on people, and you understand why you're doing it. You can do CPR. You can usually do CPT and a lot of other things that you didn't know when you started. So they're all pieces of a whole.